Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 30th of May, 2024. Let's dive in. Now, the question that we're going to be looking at today is, why did America fail in Afghanistan? The consequences of the Taliban retaking Kabul on the 15th of August, 2021, for our security at home, for our standing abroad, on the stability of the region, on the people of Afghanistan itself, we're not going to fully understand for years to come, maybe even a generation or two. But as we continue to look at how we should engage around the world with crises big and small all over the place, it's important to take a moment to look back and try to figure out, where did we go wrong? Why, after 20 years of spending our blood and treasure in Afghanistan, do we end up with the Taliban back in control? To help us dig into that very complicated issue, super excited to have the guest on that we have today. We're going to be speaking with the man who wrote the book on counterinsurgency, literally, Dr. David Kilcullen. Now, Dr. David Kilcullen is one of the most well-known counterinsurgency experts in the world. Anyone who's studied national security or geopolitics has probably had to read one or more of his books at some point. And he was instrumental to several American policies during the global war on terror. He was a special advisor for counterinsurgency to Secretary Condoleezza Rice. He was a senior counterinsurgency advisor to General David Petraeus in 2007 and 2008, where he helped design and monitor the Iraq War troop surge. He's taught at universities all over the world and currently at Arizona State University, and is one of the most influential thought leaders in this space. So excited to have this chance to sit down with him and ask him, what did America do wrong and what could we have done differently to get a different outcome? With that, let's get to our conversation with Dr. David Kilcullen. All right, and we're cooking. Dave, welcome to the podcast, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be back with you again. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's been a few years since I've bumped into you, but this will be fun.
Yeah.
There's like 5,000 nerdy things I'd love to talk to you about, but I figured if I'm getting a chance to talk to the guy who literally wrote the book on counterinsurgency, then really should be focusing on the last counterinsurgency fight that we were in Afghanistan, and trying to glean everything we can from, well, essentially what went wrong and why we failed there. So of all the things to talk about, that's where I wanted to focus today. I hope you're cool with that. I've been reading through your book over here. I got my notes out, the ledger. Wonderful, wonderful book. Haven't finished it yet, but I'm pretty sure I know how it ends. But for folks who don't know you and aren't familiar with your work, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, my name's Dave Kilcullen, originally from Australia. Been working out here in the United States since 2004 or so. My speciality is actually special warfare, but a subset of that is what we call counterinsurgency. And I served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, briefly in Libya, a bunch of other garden spots in the war on terrorism. And now I run a technology consulting firm that works with NATO and a bunch of Western militaries to think about how technology impacts on how we do our work. So lots to unpack there, of course, but yeah, that's my background in general.
Nice. No, yeah, there are ton of things we could go into there. But let's start with, when people talk about Afghanistan, a ton of words get thrown out there like guerrilla warfare, unconventional warfare, special warfare, irregular warfare, counterinsurgency, foreign internal defense. Most people don't actually know that there are differences between all these terms. Could you share with us what counterinsurgency actually is?
Yeah. And before I do that, let me just acknowledge my co-author on the book you referenced, the ledger.
Yes.
Greg Mills, right? So we spent 10 days in Morocco writing this book. It's one of the fastest books I've ever written. It was easy to write because we were both so ticked off about what had just happened in Afghanistan a couple of months before. One of the reviewers of the book said it was an angry book, and we were like, yeah, no shit, man. So
I just checked. It's 312 pages in 10 days.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's pretty good pace. So counterinsurgency is a whole of government activity that is designed to counter an insurgency, hence the name. An insurgency is a movement usually a mass movement, but manipulated or sponsored by a cadre and a resistance group to try to overthrow a state or to carve out space within a state or to separate an area from the control of a particular government or an occupying force. That's not a doctrinal definition. We change the doctrinal definition every so often, but essentially it is a resistance movement that might include an underground, a variety of auxiliary networks, and a guerrilla force that's trying to compete for control over a population and territory against a recognized government or an occupying force. And so counterinsurgency is a set of techniques that have been developed since really the 1950s or so about how Western democratic countries can deal with that threat. And I emphasize Western democratic countries because the methods that are used to counter an insurgency depend a lot on who's doing the countering, right? Like if you're Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, the dictator of Syria in 1980, and you get an insurgency in the city of Hama, you just go and massacre 40,000 people in 3 weeks and the insurgency goes away, right? Or if you're the Nazis on the Eastern Front in the 1940s, you identify Bolshevism and Judaism as being basically the same thing, and you decide the best way to counter the possibility of communist partisan warfare against your lines of operation is just wipe out everybody that's, a commissar or a member of the party or Jewish in your area of operation. Great book called War in the Wild East by a guy called Ben Shepard talks about that. So we are not the Nazis, right? And we're not Hafez al-Assad. So we can't just go out there and start eradicating whole population groups, nor would we want to. So the techniques of counterinsurgency are all about thinking, how do I get down below the layer of the armed resistance group itself, the guerrilla force, into the population that supports it, and how do I change or alter their calculus in such a way that it reduces support for the insurgency. And there's a wealth of problems in trying to do that, right? Which is why it doesn't go so well a lot of the time. Final comment is counterinsurgency is not peacekeeping, right? It's a form of warfare. And if you are doing counterinsurgency and you're not killing a substantial number of people, you're probably doing it wrong. But that doesn't mean that you just willy-nilly kill people. It means that you are engaging in a carefully controlled application of violence in order to disrupt that, network and structure that we've been talking about. And at times in Afghanistan, we went way off track in terms of the application of violence to try to achieve those ends. But I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Yes.
So that's counterinsurgency conceptually, but of course the devil's in the detail when you try to apply it in any particular society or against any particular adversary.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of folks will claim that something like Afghanistan, a counterinsurgency fight, is not something that America is capable of doing, just fundamentally. They'll point to failure in Vietnam, they'll point to the Russian experience in Afghanistan, and say that it was foolhardy for us to even attempt to do a counterinsurgency campaign. We should just never try it. It's almost like the Colin Powell doctrine that used to be floated around. Just don't do it. That's the solution. Just don't do it. But are there successful counterinsurgency campaigns in the post-World War II era that Western countries have undertaken that we can point to that show that this is actually a viable option for a state like America to pursue?
Yes, there are. And it's a bit of a fallacy to say that counterinsurgency never works. Actually, if you look at the data going back a couple of hundred years, and that gives us about 300 examples, the counterinsurgent, that is the guy countering the guerrilla force, tends to win about 80% of the time. And insurgents only win about 20% of the time. If you define winning as the violence ends and the political situation at the end is favorable, right, to that side. The US has a pretty poor track record recently, I'd say going back to the 1970s. But there are examples, earlier US examples in the Philippines, for example, a couple of places in Latin America that are successful examples. There are a lot of examples in the history of the British Commonwealth in places like Kenya, Malaya, and a couple of other locations that are positive examples of success. And then there are lots of other places like in Southern Arabia, in a variety of other locations in Europe and elsewhere, where governments have successfully countered an insurgent. But what you find is that in the cases where governments succeed, there tends to be two critical factors. One, a government is fighting in its own country, not trying to go into somebody else's country, and it's willing to negotiate around the legitimate grievances that are driving the insurgency. So if you're willing to negotiate on their grievances and you're fighting in your own country, you got a really high chance of success. If you're going into somebody else's country, one where you don't necessarily understand the culture or have the ability to make sense of the environment, and you're not willing to negotiate around the things that are driving the insurgency, your chances of success drop dramatically, right? So maybe 10 or 20%. And I would argue that that's the circumstance that we found ourselves in, probably including Vietnam, but definitely since Vietnam.
Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned in your book, if I remember correctly, is that the practice of counterinsurgency hasn't kept up with the theory behind it. We have a lot of knowledge base behind it, but our actual ability to apply the techniques from that knowledge base, it's not translating into action. Can you explain what you mean by that and why that is?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for it. One basic reason is big militaries don't like doing counterinsurgency. And so we don't study it unless we have to. And as soon as we finish a particular episode of counterinsurgency, we sort of dump the knowledge and go on to the stuff we like doing, which is the sort of conventional warfare. So that's a big factor. So we have a sort of a learning disability, right, when it comes to applying the lessons and adopting them. The other thing, weirdly enough, is there's not a lot of money in counterinsurgency, right? Like, USS Ford, the most recent US aircraft carrier, cost about $13 billion to build. The F-35 fighter aircraft, I think it's $1.7 trillion, right, for that.
Most expensive weapon system in history.
Right. So,
and one of the least used.
Yeah. So there's a lot of money, right, in conventional weapon systems. There's not a lot of money in the kinds of things that work in counterinsurgency. Local government officials, small scale spending programs, light weapons, trainers, that kind of stuff. Like, it's just not very attractive to the defense industrial base, which of course funds Congress and therefore it doesn't get a lot of attention, right? So I think that's the second issue. But then I think the third issue is actually a problem with the theory. The first stage of counterinsurgency after World War II was really a reaction to mutually assured destruction and the fact that the superpowers had nuclear weapons, which meant that if you're going to confront another superpower, it didn't make sense to confront them, conventionally, with a couple of exceptions like Korea, because that would run the risk of a massive global thermonuclear exchange. And so instead of doing that, Soviet Union, Communist China, the West began to work through proxies and surrogates to try to conduct what Khrushchev called wars of national liberation, as a way of basically screwing with their opponents without having to get into conventional conflict that might run the risk of a thermonuclear exchange. So that's when a lot of the theory was developed. And a lot of counterinsurgency theory is really 1950s modernization theory, plus guerrilla warfare theory from the Second World War, conducted under conditions of totalitarian of total conflict between nuclear armed states. So you get a lot of focus on stuff like material prosperity and finding out what populations want and giving it to them, and connecting local government with the population. All of those are good things, but that's not necessarily what's driving, say, insurgents in Iraq who just want us to leave, right? Or insurgents in Afghanistan who are fundamentally opposed to the very nature of a Western-style state that Western countries are trying to create. It's not about whether they have money in their pocket or a job or whether they can sell their goods and market. It's about, you brought in a bunch of country sellers who are infidels who are trying to turn this into something fundamentally alien to its nature, and fuck you, we're not going to accept that, right? So, I think we we needed to update the theory significantly, and often struggled to do that because those of us that do it for a living or spend a lot of time thinking about it were not the key decision makers for, really any time during the war on terror.
Yeah. Now, with Afghanistan, how do we get into a counterinsurgency fight there? How did it transition to that? Because it didn't actually start that way on day one.
No, not at all. And I think there were three key things that led to it. So the very first phase, as people will remember, was about 7 weeks of what we call unconventional warfare. So small special forces and intelligence service teams working alongside a local resistance group to overthrow an oppressive regime, and in this case, the Taliban. And the last Taliban stronghold, the city of Kandahar, fell on the 7th of December 2001, which is only about 7 weeks after the beginning of the campaign. And at that time, we had about 110 CIA and about 300 special forces, US Army special forces, plus about 5,000 Marines in country. So people will look at that and say, wow, the small footprint, Green Berets working with Northern Alliance, that's how you run this kind of campaign. That's true, but there was 50,000 Afghans fighting alongside us, which is an important point that people don't often remember. And that resulted in the sweeping away of the Taliban very quickly. First big mistake, what we should have done at that point is negotiate a peace settlement with the Taliban. Taliban actually surrendered. They offered to negotiate. They wanted to come in and come up with a negotiated solution. And I think it was Don Rumsfeld at the time, US Secretary of Defense, basically said, we don't negotiate with terrorists. So that was firstly conflating Al-Qaeda, the terrorists attacked 9/11, with the defeated Taliban regime, which is, at that time was not an accurate way of thinking about it. It increasingly became accurate over time. But more importantly, what it meant was that we never even tried to make peace. We just imposed a Western-style government designed by the UN and European countries, mostly at the Bonn Conference, over the top of a very tribal, very underdeveloped state, and more importantly, one that had been in conflict for 20 years at that point. So that was our first big mistake. Second big mistake was expanding ISAF in 2006. ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, started off as a small force that was protecting Kabul and trying to make sure that the central government was able to grow securely. In 2006, the US put a very strong push into getting NATO to intervene directly in Afghanistan and bring in other NATO nations and thereby expand the footprint of ISAF across the entire country. That was just when the insurgency was starting to get on its feet. And until that time, it had been a very special forces-centric, small footprint approach in country. It was actually working quite well in most parts of Afghanistan. But when we brought in massive Western conventional forces to do reconstruction and counterinsurgency, that brought an enormous flood of money that created incentives for corruption, which then led to abuse by officials who didn't need to win over the local population as long as they kept the local German or French or American or British garrison on side. So you got this sort of cycle of our presence bringing in money, which fueled corruption, which led to abuse, which alienated the population, which then fueled the insurgency. So we got this vicious cycle. And then the third major mistake was the so-called surge of 2009, where we basically took a template that had worked in Iraq and applied it in Afghanistan without understanding that Iraq and Afghanistan are fundamentally different societies. And things that had worked in Iraq just did not work in Afghanistan. And I think it's relevant to say here that principles translate well from one counterinsurgency campaign to another. I mean, I've fought in 7 of them. I've seen the same principles apply. But techniques almost never do. You can't just take a technique and drop it, like a template into another conflict and think it's going to work. And that's what we tried to do. We then ended the surge prematurely, pulled out the troops, and from really the end of 2014 onwards, Western countries weren't doing counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. We were doing a little bit of security force assistance and some enabling support. And I know you were involved in that yourself, Scott. But it was the counterinsurgency campaign run by the Afghan government that was really happening there. And there were all kinds of pathologies involved in how that went down, which we can talk about separately. But so they would be my three sort of big turning point mistakes we made: failing to negotiate peace when we had the chance, expanding the conflict really for the sake of just getting the alliance engaged, and then trying to drop techniques from Iraq unchanged into a very different situation in Afghanistan.
Let me ask you about the American decision-making process, because the surge in Iraq was controversial at the time. People still debate it, but for the most part, it's credited with being success, whether it's directly because of the surge or other factors going around it, but it's credited with being a successful strategy at the time. What decision-making process was used to decide to do that surge, and not just the troop surge, but the change in strategy in Iraq, some of the other techniques that were employed on the ground, and why, if the techniques didn't translate, why did the decision-making process not translate? Or do we just not bother to do one for Afghanistan at that time?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So there was an enormous amount of effort put into designing the surge. General Petraeus was at that time in Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, and he spent more than a year building an entire new counterinsurgency doctrine, working with the Marine Corps, civilian organizations, human rights agencies, really comprehensive effort, which produced a very thorough rethinking of counterinsurgency. That doctrine was one factor in the temporary success of the surge. I mean, it did successfully reduce violence in Iraq by about 96% in a 9-month period. So I would call that a success. It also created the political conditions for the Iraqis to begin to deal with their issues through negotiation and discussion rather than car bombings and assassinations. So it succeeded in that sense. But we didn't maintain the effort. We pulled out rapidly as soon as we'd achieved that level of stability, or of peace, not stability. And we never put the effort in at the national level to what we call war termination, right? Translating temporary battlefield success into enduring political outcomes. So I would say that the counterinsurgency technique worked in Iraq, but we didn't successfully translate it into a political outcome in Iraq. The other big factor that happened in the surge in Iraq, and I would say is probably the decisive factor. So I guess there's really 4 things that happened during the surge. One was the new doctrine, the counterinsurgency doctrine. The second was the leadership of General Petraeus. The third was the troop surge itself, so about 50,000 new troops in about 5 months, starting with 30,000 at the beginning. And then the unexpected, but I think the decisive factor, was the Sahawa, the awakening of the Sunni tribes against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And I would argue the awakening was the decisive factor. The awakening was not predicted in our doctrine. It's not part of our counterinsurgency theory. It actually took General Petraeus a little while to realize what was going on, but then he was very agile in adapting to that. And that was what actually fundamentally shifted the environment in Iraq in 2007. So we went into Afghanistan in 2008 thinking, well, that was amazing, right? We achieved this great success. We put our success down to the counterinsurgency doctrine itself, without recognizing that actually the surge, was a different thing from counterinsurgency, and the awakening is not reflected in our doctrine, right? So we never really, I did it at the time and a few other people did, but as an institution, the military never sat down and said, what was it that triggered the awakening and why did the awakening work? And we went into Afghanistan thinking that we would apply a surge of troops, the new counterinsurgency doctrine. We even brought General Petraeus in as the commander at one point, and we tried to just replicate what happened in Iraq. But it's a very different environment, right? You're not in an environment where you can make a deal with a tribal leader, as you can in Iraq, and that deal will stick. Because Afghan tribes are not like Iraqi tribes. They're not a hierarchical structure. They're every male adult in a tribal jirga, in a council of discussion, has exactly the same level of status as anybody else, right? So the ability to make a deal with an individual and have that deal stick is just not there in Afghanistan in the same way. Separately, the war in Iraq was driven in 2006 very much by non-Iraqis and people that were not from the areas where they were operating. So many Syrians, many Jordanians, but also urban Iraqis, right, who were not part of the rural communities where they were. That's not what was going on in Afghanistan. What we had was basically a rural vigilante law and order justice movement that was mobilized by opposition to corruption and opposition to a fundamental change in their way of life, and actually had quite a lot of good local support, and was much less brutal at the beginning than Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So we were dealing with a fundamentally different beast in Afghanistan, but we tried to apply those same techniques from Iraq, and unsurprisingly, they didn't really work. And I think the other factor that is a bit less important, but still relevant, is that political leaders tend to equate strategy with troop numbers. And troop numbers is not the strategy. That's just a means you might use to execute the strategy. So they said, well, we gave you 30,000 troops for Iraq, and that worked. So how come it's not working to give you 30,000 troops in Afghanistan? And what happened there was that General McChrystal, who was the commander at the beginning of the surge, did an analysis where he said, right, I need about 60,000 troops because I have to simultaneously suppress the Taliban in both the east and the south of the country, or I won't be able to get it done. So he went back with an analysis to Washington and said, I need 60,000 troops. And he was just laughed out of the room, right, in the Pentagon. They said, don't even bother asking the Obama guys for that. They're not going to give it to you. So he asked for 60,000, was told, don't ask for that. I think he ended up asking for about 40,000, and he got about 25,000. So less than half what you would have needed to execute the surge. So then he said, all right, well, what I have to do now is rapidly do the south and then quickly switch to the east in order to make it work. The southern part of the campaign went quite well, but as soon as we saw progress in the south, the administration decided to pull the troops out. So he basically used less than half the troops for less than a third of the time in only half of the territory. So, I mean, that's a macro view of why things screwed up during the surge in Afghanistan. So long answer to a short question, but a very important point there, Scott.
Yeah. Well, you brought up another point there too. The relationship between the generals actually fighting the war, trying to fight the war, and the civilian leadership that's actually in charge of the Department of Defense and our national security strategy. How did that relationship or lack of relationship affect the ability to actually execute on the ground in Afghanistan? Because there always seemed to be a disconnect, even when I was there at the very tail end of things, between how people were viewing the conflict on the ground and the way political leaders were talking about it in Washington, both publicly and privately.
Yeah, that's a great point. So during the surge period, so I'd say end of the Bush administration, beginning of maybe the first term of Obama, the relationship was characterized by, so the relationship between commanders in the field and political leaders was characterized by, I think, a reluctance of civilian leaders to really take responsibility for translating battlefield success into enduring political outcomes. That's that war termination thing I talked about before. People just wanted to say, well, Petraeus is on the ground, or Scott Miller's on the ground. These guys know what they're doing. We've given them the resources. Now we're just going to get out of their way and let them prosecute the campaign. Even as commanders on the ground were saying, no, that's not going to work. It's not just a military solution. We can't defeat a mass political movement with purely kinetic military means, right? So there was a disconnect there. I think the other issue that happened was that domestic political considerations, as they always do, shaped the strategy in ways that made it really difficult to execute on the ground. Most notably when President Obama announced the surge in December of 2009 in a speech at West Point. I happened to be on the ground in Kabul at the time, talking to some pro-Taliban business people. And Obama came up to this podium and announced the surge and then said, and this is like December 2009, and said, it'll be limited and we will begin withdrawing in July of 2011. In the end, we didn't actually begin withdrawing until 2014. But we stated, or President Obama stated the end time or the end point for the surge right up front. And he did that for domestic political reasons. He was trying to make it clear that it wouldn't be an open-ended commitment. But the guys that I was with in Kabul, when they heard that speech, just started laughing. And they said, are you guys trying to lose? Like, your president just told the Afghan people, we're surging, but don't worry, we're leaving in July of 2011. So the Taliban are now just going to go quiet and wait for the surge to end. And they're going to go out on the street tomorrow and they're going to say to the population, hey, the president just said they're leaving in July. You might like the Americans, but they'll be gone in July 2011. What are you guys going to do in August? Because we'll still be there and the Americans will be gone. So I think by just stating up front that we were going to leave so quickly, we gave the very helpful piece of information to the Taliban of exactly how long they needed to wait for us to leave.
Yeah.
And the final disconnect was in the Trump period and into the Biden administration, where political leaders just wanted it to be over. And they weren't really listening to what was happening on the ground. Guys like Zalmay Khalilzad, one of the most destructive US officials of the last 20 years, negotiated the Doha agreement with the Taliban, which essentially surrendered the conflict to the Taliban in return for the Taliban helping us against the Islamic State, which had emerged in 2015 in Afghanistan. And Afghan allies and commanders on the ground and US leaders in the field were screaming from, the signing of that that agreement in February 2020 onward, that the Taliban were not honoring the agreement. They were continuing to attack Afghan allies. They were continuing to encircle Afghan government bases, but people just didn't want to hear it in the US. They were so determined to end it that they closed their eyes and blocked their ears to what was being told to them by commanders on the ground. And that just became worse and worse over time. And we saw the outcome in August of 2021.
Yeah, when we were going from 2020 into 2021, things had gotten to the point in country where we were dealing with mass casualty events on a nightly basis. I was running at that point I was running the crisis response group for regional targeting team North in Balkh province. We had the 9 northern provinces of Afghanistan under our purview. But I was shocked the first time where I called an airstrike, do the storyboard, battle damage assessment, all this normal stuff, send it up, and get the calls like, hey, we need you to redo this, but sanitize some stuff. It's like, oh, you're changing the format? Like, what's the new paperwork drill we got to do here? It's like, no, we need to go brief the Taliban in Doha on why you dropped a bomb on them last night.
Correct.
I was like, you've got to be fucking kidding. Like, I got it, but it was just such a weird thing. Like, I have to brief the Taliban on why I'm dropping bombs on them.
We were literally running our targeting decisions, in some cases ahead of time, past the Taliban adversary in Doha. That was a requirement of the Doha agreement negotiated by Zalmay Khalilzad and supported by both presidents. I'm sure you saw this too. You could see, looking through overhead imagery, Taliban concentrations of force gathering around Afghan government positions or Afghan military bases. We would be reporting those up the chain and would be not allowed to strike those targets. And in some cases, not even allowed to inform our Afghan allies of what was happening on the ground, right? It's just no way to fight a war. The flip side of that was the Taliban was supposed to be helping us with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS. I'm aware of maybe 2 or 3 occasions where they gave some useful targeting guidance to strikes on Islamic State. In return for that, we gave them the whole country. So I think that just shows you that there was a massive disconnect between the reality on the ground, particularly as our Afghan allies were experiencing it, and the theory of what was happening, and then the level of caring about it, which is basically zero, on the part of politicians in the White House and elsewhere. I fundamentally, though, blame military leaders in the Pentagon, from the Secretary of Defense to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs to the Commander of CENTCOM, for not speaking truth to power about what was going on the ground and not holding accountable the civilian leaders who made those decisions for the outcomes of their decisions. And to this day, no one's ever been held accountable for what happened in Afghanistan in 2021. But it goes way further back than that, well back into the Trump administration. Unfortunately, it's been treated as a partisan political thing between Republicans and Democrats, between the Biden administration, who presided over the disaster, and the Republicans. But actually, this is both parties, 4 presidents, all the way back to George W. Bush. So Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, same pathologies all the way through. and the same, if you like, can-do attitude and unwillingness to rock the boat on behalf of senior civilian leaders. Senior military and civilian leaders in the Pentagon. And I think it's a stain on us that we were never able to resolve that problem.
Yeah, the lack of accountability. It's a bad joke, but it's very true. A private gets in more trouble for losing a pair of nods than a general does for losing a war in the American military.
Yeah, that tells you what the organization thinks is important, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you can have every battlefield failure on the planet and have a wonderful career. We do a lot of things well. Winning wars is not a requirement for high rank in the U.S. military, though.
Right, and or many other militaries too, by the way, modern Western militaries. So in the Civil War, President Lincoln fired multiple commanders before he finally settled on Ulysses S. Grant as a guy who would actually execute. In World War II, people, particularly in the Navy after Pearl Harbor, or in the in the African theater after the campaign in Tunisia, generals are getting fired left, right, and center, right? And political leaders were getting the right team in place to execute the strategy they wanted to execute. We don't do that now, right? If you make a mistake on your travel expenses, or you are accused of sexual harassment by a member of your staff, then you're gone the next day, right? If you increasingly use the wrong pronouns or something, you're going to get in massive trouble. But losing a war, not really a big deal. And that then communicates to the organization what the institution cares about and what the institution doesn't care about. And that means that that I think that has something to do with the fact that we haven't actually won a war recently. I mean, the last war we really won was World War II, right? Korea was a draw. The Gulf War in 1991 was a partial battlefield success that didn't result in an enduring political victory. And then everything else since then we've ultimately lost. It's not 100% true, actually, to say that no one was held accountable. So no one offered to resign or was fired or was asked to quit as a result of the disaster in August 2021. No one, from the president to Secretary Blinken or Secretary Austin to Jake Sullivan, who was a key architect of the plan, to Zal Khalilzad, who got no accountability, to the undersecretaries in the Pentagon or any of the generals, General Milley, General McKenzie, none of those guys quit or offered to quit or was fired. But one U.S. Marine Corps lieutenant colonel complained about the fact that no one was being held accountable. We threw his ass in jail, right? Mm-hmm. So what does that tell you, right? It tells you that the thing that you can do that the organization cares about is critique the conventional wisdom. And I guarantee you that lesson has been thoroughly absorbed by sergeants, captains, lieutenant colonels in the organization. And that's bad, right? Because if you think, as I do, that we are going to face some pretty tough times coming up, then we actually need a fighting force that's capable of, speaking truth to itself and adapting when the environment changes. I'd argue that evidence from Afghanistan suggests we don't have that right now.
Yeah, I accidentally stepped in it once. We were having a key leader visit. I forget which general it was. It was one of them. I meant I had to shave, so I didn't like it. With key leader visit coming up to northern Afghanistan. So everyone's like, make sure you have questions ready. And questions have to be vetted. It's like, okay, everyone put their questions in. My question was along the lines of, well, we're leaving. It's 2020. We're leaving next year. But we're transitioning to great power competition. We got Iran over here, Pakistan right there, India, China. What human infrastructure should we be preparing to leave behind to maintain an ability to monitor and influence events on the ground in Afghanistan once we're not physically here? And how do we start setting this up? Mm-hmm. And mentioning the fact that we were actually leaving the following year and that was on the schedule was not something that anyone wanted to bring up in front of the general. So that got quashed.
Totally. And, we can get into that, but some people in the Pentagon argued until about April of 2021 that we should leave a residual force, but they were shot down, and that argument was lost against the civilians in the Biden White House. I would argue, again, it's not a partisan thing. They probably would have lost that argument against the Trump people as well. But when it was about May the 9th or so, so about a month after President Biden announced the timeline, there was a critical meeting in the Pentagon that was attended by both civilian and military leadership, at which the military just said, all right, well, if we've lost the argument and we're not leaving a residual force, let's just get out as quickly as we can. And they come up with a timeline to pull out by the end of June, right? And, our buddies in 10th Group, who were the last US Special Forces group to be in Afghanistan, pulled out on the 20th of June. And we abandoned Bagram Air Base, which was critical to the Afghan strategy, on the 1st of July. Within 6 weeks, the country had collapsed. So I think that shows you just a breakdown of dialogue between civilian and military leaders, where it was almost passive aggressive, right, on the part of the Pentagon leadership to be like, all right, well, if you're not listening to us, screw you guys. We're going to pull out quickly. It's going to collapse. It'll be all your fault, right? Well, again, there's no way to fight a war, right? We're all on the same side here, or we should be. It also resulted in the abandonment of not just the Afghan allies, but all the other nations that had fought alongside the US. I mean, Australia was working for months before the announcement to get their people out, their Afghan allies out, recognizing that it was going to collapse. The British were doing the same thing, but not every ally was fully in the loop on what was happening. And many were caught flat-footed and then were not able to rescue people that had worked with them over the 20 years when the plan went down. And that, I would argue, had a really significant impact on NATO and on the US reputation, and frankly, on Russian calculations about what to do in Ukraine. I mean, the Russians have been very upfront that watching the collapse in Afghanistan was a key moment for them in thinking, okay, we'll probably get away with seizing Crimea in 2022. Watching, not 6 months later, them roll into Ukraine. It's a recognition of them thinking, all right, well, the US is a paper tiger. Its allies don't trust it. And the Americans are saying exactly the same things now about Ukraine that they were saying about Afghanistan 6 months ago. But when it came to the moment, they never fought to defend Afghanistan, so they're not going to fight to defend Ukraine. Fundamental miscalculation on the part of the Russians, but you can understand why they made that judgment based on looking at what happened in Afghanistan. So to your earlier point, what happens in Afghanistan doesn't stay in Afghanistan, right? The implications of failure in a major 20-year conflict like that resonate and expand out to other things.
Well, one of the interesting things too was just how fast the government collapsed, because it was genuinely shocking. Like it was falling apart faster than the Taliban could advance, which was embarrassing to watch. But question there is, we spent 20 years trying to build up this Afghan government, but there did not appear to be a unifying political force in Afghanistan capable of holding that country together. And it's actually interesting to juxtapose that against Ukraine, which went up against Russia and has successfully maintained its sovereignty for the past several years, despite being massively outgunned and outnumbered. But they had the political will to fight. And in Afghanistan, there was a lot of people fighting, but there was nobody fighting for a unified Afghan government. So how did we spend 20 years trying to build this thing, which ended up being more hollow than the promises we made to those people?
Well, I mean, we could talk about this for a week, but let me just point to a couple of factors, civilian and military. On the civilian side, we put much too much attention on the central government institutions and not enough on local government systems. We didn't try to have legitimate, effective, locally respected, capable officials at the district level. Instead, we focused on building infrastructure at the central level in Kabul. A good example of that is rule of law, right? We spent years rewriting the Afghan legal code and building a Supreme Court building and creating an entirely new set of legal norms. Meanwhile, the Taliban were out there resolving disputes and suppressing petty crime for a decade without any Afghan government, competing institution at the local level. Similarly, I went out with local government officials many times in the periods that I was in Afghanistan. And one of the things I often noticed was that some would start to go down and you'd see them surreptitiously checking their watch. It used to remind me of that movie, I Am Legend, where Will Smith, is out late in the afternoon and he starts checking his watch because when the sun goes down, the vampires come out, or zombies or whatever they are, and eat him. And you realize when you see enough Afghan officials do that, but the reason they're doing it is they don't live in their district, right? They're only there because I'm there. And as soon as we're gone, they're going back to the provincial capital or back to Kabul. So if you've got essentially an absentee local government, then there isn't that political resilience, right, to make people wish to fight, even though they don't like the Taliban. It's not enough to not like the Taliban. You also have to believe that the government will be there when you need them. And people just didn't. So that was the civil side, and many more things to say on that. I mean, we spent a lot of time pursuing luxury beliefs with the Afghan government, instead of focusing on just basic competence and effectiveness at the local level. The other big thing, though, is military. So I mentioned that after the end of 2014, we were not conducting counterinsurgency, the Afghan military were, and we were enabling. And if you look at our losses, on average between 2015 and 2020, not counting the guys that got killed at Kabul airport during the withdrawal, 13 Americans, but almost 200 Afghans too, by the way. But not counting them, Western countries are losing about 10 to 12 people a year in Afghanistan from 2014 onward. And that's tragic for those individuals and for their families. But it doesn't move the needle in terms of a great power trying to conduct a campaign, right? I mean, US Army lost more people in traffic accidents than it did in Afghanistan between 2015 and 2020. So the war was very sustainable for us, right, for the Western countries. We could have kept doing it pretty much forever. But it wasn't sustainable for the Afghan military because they were losing, I mean, by the end of that conflict, they were losing about 5,000 people killed a month, just trying to sustain the effort. And increasingly what they were doing was we had built, I think, too big special forces organization, which was so big that it was sucking talent from the rest of the Afghan military. And we then didn't have the talent in the Kandaks, the battalion level organizations at the local level to defend local districts. So we had to keep throwing special forces units in like a fire brigade to bail them out. And progressively, we ended up just killing off the best guys in the ANA because we were throwing them into these hopeless situations to rescue local units. And as things got worse and worse during the campaign of 2021, the Taliban started putting forward this pattern where they would partially surround a local Afghan base. They would then send in a negotiator and say, guys, we're going to kill a lot of you, right? And your family will be destitute. You'll never have, we might even kill your family as well. Or we're willing to make a deal now. Surrender your base. We'll give you money. We'll give you safe passage, and you can go home and protect your family. And increasingly, knowing that there was no air support, knowing that the Americans weren't going to help them, having watched us not protect them multiple times, a number of local commanders began to take those deals. And then the network effect, right? If there's 12 bases in a province and 8 of them have already taken that deal, like you might be a dedicated commander who wants to fight on forever, but what's the point? Like if everyone else is surrendering, you're just going to get you guys killed for nothing. So we started to see cascading collapse from about April of 2021. And then that just accelerated to the point where whole districts and then eventually whole provinces were falling rapidly. And the Afghan special forces, who were still dedicated to a united Afghanistan, they were some of the most professional elements, guys like Sami Sadat, the last commander of Afghan special forces, he would be recognized as a professional, competent general in command of troops in any army in the world, right? World-class leader, but doesn't have the political support and the local environment's just collapsing all around him, right? So at some point, there's nothing you can do, even if you have a capable unit and a good commander. So within the last 11 days, right, we saw every province except for one, the Panjshir, collapse, and then Kabul collapsed, and then about 3 weeks later, Panjshir itself collapsed. So sort of an accelerating, cascading collapse. If people are interested, Gordon McCormick, who's a counterinsurgency theorist at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, wrote a great paper on this called Things Fall Apart, about the endgame dynamics of a counterinsurgency environment where you get this accelerating collapse because the state is complex and it has multiple moving parts that all have to work together. So once you get closer and closer to that endpoint, it just falls apart more and more rapidly. And he wrote that well before the collapse in Afghanistan, but you could have taken that paper, and I actually did, and used it to explain to people what was going to happen in Afghanistan. But as we said, no one was listening.
Yeah. I remember the first time, it was Puli Kumri, the first time I actually saw an outpost just disintegrate without a fight. And yeah, they were surrounded for 12 hours, and we were talking with them. We were getting air support. We were actually getting a commando unit spun up to go help them out. And we're about 2 hours away from being on the ground. And we see a parade of trucks going through the desert heading out towards Badakhshan. And we're like, what are you doing, dude?
Yeah.
And guys are like, yeah, we're done.
Yeah. Also, around that time, I think it was in May, there was a famous incident where the son of a general surrendered with there's like 20 odd guys from his base, and the Taliban lined them all up on the side of the road and shot them in front of cameras, and that became a massive morale hit to Afghan commanders generally. But the Taliban reaction to that was interesting. They reprimanded and criticized the local Taliban who did that massacre and put it on television, because they basically were saying, like, guys, what you're going to do now is make them more willing to fight, because they're going to think we're going to execute them if they surrender. We don't want that. We just want them all to quit and leave. So Taliban maintained their focus really well during that campaign of 2021 in a way that they're actually struggling now, right? The Taliban in control of Afghanistan today are a lot less unified or a lot more fragmented than they were in 2021, partly because in 2021 they had lots of regional groups that were fighting in their own region to regain control. And after the fall of Kabul, a lot of those regional commanders felt like they were sidelined and not treated with the respect that they felt they'd earned, because it was them ultimately who won the war on behalf of the Taliban. So separate question, but I think we're actually starting to see the Taliban regime in Afghanistan now suffer many of the same problems that the Afghan government suffered before the collapse.
One of the common critiques that we hear from folks about, especially from guys who served in Afghanistan, is that the central government never really mattered. It had no legitimacy. And because of the tribal nature of Afghanistan and the rough terrain and the geographic dispersion, there's really no possible way to have a centralized country there. And Afghanistan's not really a country. It's just a territory that no one else has bothered to conquer. But you actually critique that a bit in your book, and I was surprised to see it. So what is your take on the ability of Afghanistan to be a nation state under anyone's rule? Because no one seems to have done it well in 40 or 50 some odd years now.
Right. I mean, this is a bullshit argument, right? It is a cop-out. It's an excuse we use to tell ourselves that, hey, the war was unwinnable. It wasn't unwinnable. We just lost, right? And we need to own that. Otherwise, we're not going to improve. But between about the 1880s and the 1970s, Afghanistan was a relatively unified, not governable society. It didn't look like a Western state. The central government, royal, government until the end of the monarchy in 1974, didn't do a lot of things that we expect of a Western state. It basically controlled the borders. It ensured safety on the roads. It protected provincial governors from their own province, right? It collected taxes and excise, mostly from businesses, not from the Afghan people. That was about it, right? That's all it really did. So it basically set the framework within which a series of really powerful provincial governors and really powerful local chiefs ran the society. So the central government was not a strong government, but it was a strong society that held together through multiple foreign invasions between the 1880s and the 1920s, and went through rapid modernization through the 1940s to the 1970s, and was able to hold. But it didn't do a lot of the things that you expect of a Western European style government to do, right? So just as one example, before 1974, there were no police below the province level, right? At the local level, all policing functions were carried out by locally appointed posses that basically worked to the district chief and the tribal elder to enforce decisions of the jirga that was made in conjunction with the local district leader. There were police at the provincial level, but their job was to act as a bodyguard for the provincial governor and protect him from the province, right? They weren't doing like traffic fines. So we come in and we try to impose this government that's utterly foreign to the experience of Afghanistan, where you've got the central government that does all kinds of things badly instead of doing just a few things well. And so, it's not accurate to say that Afghanistan is not a real country. It is a real country. It's been a real country for much of its history, but a series of Western interventions, and the Russians were a Western intervention, if you think about it, a European modernizing intervention in 1979, and then our intervention after 9/11, have failed to force Afghanistan to conform to a Eurocentric idea of what a state needs to be. And I would suggest that that's a problem with our Eurocentrism rather than Afghanistan. If we'd have, instead of focusing on trying to make it look like Switzerland, if instead of doing that, we'd have said, right, strong local districts, we don't care whether you're Taliban or not, but you have to be effective, legitimate, you have to be exercising actual governance over local areas. And then we're going to have provinces that, deploy and manage resources to support those local governments. And we're going to have a fairly small, not very powerful central government that does a small number of things well. Mainly in this case would have been taking international assistance and distributing it fairly amongst the provinces. And again, if we'd have done that peace deal at the beginning, we would have by then made peace with the Taliban and wouldn't have had to be excluding them from areas where people supported them. We could have been like, yeah, man, you're the guy recognized by the local community. You're the guy that is in charge of this area, but don't break the rules that we're laying down from the province or the national level. I think you would have had a whole different outcome. And we would have also then built an Afghan military that looked a lot more like the Taliban, right? Small teams, mobile, lightly equipped, agile, not big lumbering, Western style military, but it would have operated under the authority of a legitimate local authority and within boundaries set by the international community. Again, these things were not, this isn't after the fact, right? This stuff was all suggested at the time, right? But we went in a whole different way.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about us and we've talked about the Afghans. Let's hit on the neighborhood real quick. Mm-hmm. Pakistan. Mm-hmm. Interfering in Afghanistan and countering our efforts there the entire time, while also being our most important regional ally in the fight. What did we get right and wrong with our relationship with Pakistan? Because they could have been a huge asset for our fight in Afghanistan, and we never really seemed to understand how to leverage them. In fact, they were actively opposing the majority of our efforts in the country.
The rationale for Pakistani action was driven by fear of strategic encirclement with India, their fundamental enemy on the east. They didn't want to see a strong pro-Western, potentially pro-Indian government on their west. So they needed to keep Afghanistan unstable and weak in order to prevent that strategic encirclement. So it was sort of great power politics as much as anything else. That was one issue. The other issue was that the Pakistanis who were in charge, many of whom come from eastern Pakistan and from urban environments, tended to look down on the Taliban and look down on Afghans generally, and they didn't believe that Afghanistan was capable of governing itself. So they wanted to exercise that interference or mentorship, as they would put it, into Afghanistan in order to prevent a collapse of the state. So that all drove them to do what they were doing. Then there were two other factors. One was the massive amount of money that we paid Pakistan for what are called coalition support funds to support the logistics and other support elements of having a large force in Afghanistan. So it gave them an enormous financial incentive in continuing the conflict. So they treated the Afghan Taliban like a insurance policy, right? We can always reach in and control what happens if we maintain a good relationship with the Afghan Taliban, but they were also running a sort of two-sided policy where they were also supporting us for monetary reasons. And the final thing is that Al-Qaeda inside Pakistan, including Osama bin Laden, who was living less than a mile from the Pakistani West Point for about a decade, they were a cash cow for the government in Islamabad because that it forced us to treat Pakistan, which is not as important a country as India in terms of population or economy or anything else, as an equal to India because we needed them to support us in Afghanistan and help us against Al Qaeda. That's why I think the Al Qaeda leadership survived untouched for so long in Pakistan. Not because the Pakistanis didn't necessarily know where they were, but because they had no incentive to clean up the source of hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in coalition revenue that was all coming to them. I mean, we made them a major non-NATO ally. We treated them as an equal to India. We funded them to the tune of billions of dollars, all because they had Al Qaeda in their territory and were neighboring to Afghanistan. So they had zero incentive to change that. Ironically, now there's a lot of regret coming from Pakistan because they're getting massive blowback from the Pakistani Taliban and Islamic State, and to some extent the Afghan Taliban against Islamabad now that we've left. And I think, just as we need to ask ourselves some hard questions and think about what we did wrong during that last 20 years in Afghanistan, Pakistani leaders need to be making the same analysis and saying, maybe it seemed like a good idea at the time, but it wasn't the right way to approach it.
Yeah. One of the final things I want to ask you is, how do we do better next time? What lessons do we want to learn? But one of the themes I'm getting from what you've been saying for the past 50 some odd minutes is that we had the knowledge we needed to make better choices at various points in this conflict that could have drastically changed the outcome, but we consistently chose the wrong path. So how do we make better choices next time with the information that we already have?
Yeah. So this is a question that goes well beyond anything to do with defense and well beyond Afghanistan or counterinsurgency. It's a pathology in modern Western democratic societies that we treat any disagreement or any unwelcome information as disinformation and as a threat to the consensus view. You can think about things that came up during COVID, for example, where respected doctors said, no, what you guys are doing is not working, and were treated as pariahs for just daring to come up with an alternative point of view. You see the same thing on, whistleblowers being shut down in Boeing, for example, or, people pointing out that, waterfront infrastructure is going to collapse, and then it does, and no one listens. So we've got this pathology now where we treat politeness and consensus and safety as more important than truth and speaking, truth to power and having honest disagreements, which then result in better outcomes. And one of the few advantages that democracies have over non-democratic states when it comes to these kinds of conflicts is that we often make mistakes early, but we can be a learning organization where we learn from those mistakes. But that only works if you're willing to admit to yourself that things aren't working, and if you're willing to listen to people that disagree and not immediately call them, merchants of disinformation or Putin lovers or whatever it is, right? And I think we've lost the ability recently in Western society writ large to have substantive disagreement without having that descend into name calling. And the reasons for that go well beyond COIN, right? They're not really to do with counterinsurgency, they're to do with modern society generally. But as it relates to counterinsurgency, I think there's three really important things we have to do with doing better next time. First one is to recognize that there will be a next time, right? Every time we end one of these major campaigns, we go, oh, thank God that's over. We're never going to do that again. And we literally, after Vietnam, we burned all the lessons learned reports. You'll struggle to find anybody doing serious lessons learned work other than maybe SIGAR, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, doing serious lessons learned work on what happened in Afghanistan. Everyone's just like, thank God that's over. It'll never happen again. But if you look, start your timeline in the middle of the 19th century and bring it forward to now, US does a big one of these about every 25 years, and it does little ones every 5 years or so. That's been a consistent pattern for almost 200 years, and it has nothing to do with whether military leaders or political leaders want to or not. We just do it anyway. It's something inherent in the nature of how the US engages with the rest of the world, right? So there will be a next time. There'll probably be a couple of little ones and then a big one in another 10 or 15 years or so. So we've got to get the lessons right. The second key thing we have to do, I think, is understand the relationship between civilian and military efforts better. The military subset of counterinsurgency we used to call counter-guerrilla warfare, right? So the military elements of fighting the military aspect of an insurgency. We're actually pretty good at that, right? We've repeatedly had battlefield successes against the military component of insurgencies over the last 20 years. That's not where our problem lies, right? Our problem lies in translating battlefield military success into enduring political success. I've talked about that a few times. And in the counterinsurgency world, the way that you do that is the governance piece and the rule of law piece and the focus on local level accountability and legitimacy and the politics and the those aspects. And we pretty much suck at those. Military commanders don't listen to civilian leaders. Civilian leaders don't get enough time to develop sophisticated ways of thinking about it. We don't have the local area knowledge, right, to do what we need to do when these things come up. So we just tend to struggle in translating civilian to military and vice versa. And the final lesson is political leaders need to really engage on this stuff better. It's not about some templated military technique that's called counterinsurgency and you just run that out and roll it out and successful follow, right? That's a really puerile way of thinking about it. You wouldn't do it in any other area, right? You wouldn't say, let's do some architecture, right? Let's do some medicine, right? Mm-hmm. You'd have an evidence-based approach where you took an understanding of the environment, you treated that environment using an understanding of various techniques that work and don't work, and you brought in the relevant players to think about it. No political leader would think about engaging in any domestic political program without first analyzing the best practices and how to go forward. We need to apply that same level of commitment and rigor to counterinsurgency next time around. And frankly, if you're a political leader and you're not willing to put that level of effort in, the most important lesson then would be don't do it, right? Like, don't go there if you if you're not willing to put in the effort and think about it. But as I've said, plenty of political leaders have said repeatedly that we're not going to do it again, but we always seem to do it. So I think it behooves us all to think about next time around, how are we going to do it? Which is not the same thing as saying you want to do it. One of the things I think is a bit unfair is that people that aren't in the counterinsurgency community often assume that the counterinsurgency people want to do counterinsurgency and want to get out there and do it. Actually, our community has been one of the strongest voices saying before Iraq and before Afghanistan, hey, this is a bad idea. And I think next time around, probably listen to the people that spend their professional lives doing this stuff and don't fucking do it unless there's a really good reason. But if you are going to do it, don't half do it, do it properly.
Yeah. Well, according to my calendar, then we're due for another one in about 1 year, 9 months. So we just need mature political leadership, academic rigor in our decision making, and some foresight before we act. So we should be able to work that out in the next
year and 9 months.
Yeah. No, we got this. We got this.
Got some super talented people in charge right now. Yeah. No, for those of us that have been on the cutting edge, right? Mm-hmm. Don't be too black-pilled here. I mean, this is not, this does not invalidate your sacrifice or the sacrifice of your families or what was done on the ground. Afghanistan today is a fundamentally different country than it would have been in 2001. And there is a true, real movement in favor of a democratic, peaceful Afghanistan that's going on in Afghanistan right now. You won't find it in the pages of the New York Times or on CNN, but it is real. And the Taliban haven't won yet. They're just temporarily ruling the roost. So, don't think that, everything we did was in vain, because it wasn't.
No, well said. Well, I really want to thank you for coming on and talking us through this. It was a great conversation. Love your book. I'll throw a link to it in the show notes for folks to find it. But if people want to find you and your work, where can they find you?
So I teach at the University of New South Wales, and also have done some work with Arizona State University in the past. I've got another book coming out on resistance warfare sometime soon. and I'm not on social media. I don't have time for that.
It's probably smart.
But yeah, I mean, people can sort of find me through a Google search of like-minded Substack and so on. And obviously, for those that are still in, I do a lot of work with US SOCOM, UKSF, Australian SOCOMAND. I'm out there with the boys on a fairly regular basis.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. And let me just again acknowledge my co-author on the book, Greg Mills. A great man and a key contributor to that work.
Excellent.
All right. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening in today. If you liked what you heard, please follow the podcast and share with your friends, and even consider going to the support the show link in the episode description. Thank you, and I'll see you all next time.